Topic notes 5.5, bony fish. Now, other than marine mammals, fish are probably one of the key things people think about when they think about studying marine biology. And this is a picture of a flounder, one of the unique species that has really cool adaptation where at the larval stage, one of the eyes migrates to the other side of the head, giving you this really cool adaptation to lie flat on the ground with both eyes staring straight up. So the main idea for this note set is that bony fish are the largest group of vertebrates in the ocean and are especially adapted to living in an aquatic environment. Bony fish also play an important role in nutrient cycling, trophic level lengths, and human economic systems. And of course, there are some more targeted, a little wordy learning goals down there, so make sure you pay attention. Now it's time to look at the features of phylum Chordata, which happens to be the phylum we are in. It also happens to be the phylum fish are in. And chordates in general have a few very key features at some point in their life cycle. The first we'll talk about is the notochord. Now the notochord is a flexible rod-shaped organ that extends the length of the body and allows the body to bend during muscle contractions. Now the notochord is really an important part of chordates because of a few reasons. First of all, as it develops, it helps to run signals around from the embryo, and essentially what you're seeing in the image on the bottom there is kind of a generic embryonic chordate, right? And it also provides for muscle attachment, things like that. But even more important, it is essentially the precursor to the vertebral column. This is essentially where our vertebrae start to form from. Now, the next component is the dorsal neural tube. Now, that tube is a tube-shaped organ that extends the length of the body. Now, on the anterior side, or the head side, that becomes the brain. On the posterior side, it becomes the spinal cord. So you can imagine between the notochord, which will become the vertebral column, and the dorsal neural tube, which will essentially become the spinal cord in the brain, this is an essential part of chordates. Next up, we have the pharyngeal slits. Now, these link the mouth cavity and the digestive system. Now, in fish, they develop into gill arches and, of course, help part of the respiratory system there. In mammals and birds, of course, we are mammals, they are only present during embryonic development and then essentially become the jaws and inner ear bones. So that's the shift that occurs for us. Now, we also have the postanal tail. Yes, we've all have a tail as an embryo, and that tail is used for swimming and is located at the rear of the fish, only present during the embryonic stages in a lot of other chordates, including us. But in fish, obviously, it lingers on. Now let's talk about fish, and we'll talk a little bit about the phylogenetic overview of fish, although we're not going to get too much into the weeds here. First of all, fish are in subphylum Vertebrata because they do have a fully developed vertebrae. Now there are three major groups of fish that we can talk about. There are the jawless fish, or the agnathans. There are the bony fish, which we call osteichthyes, think osteoporosis, bone, things like that. And then there's class chondrichthyes, which are cartilaginous fish. That's your sharks and rays. Now, we are going to concentrate on this note set on osteichthyes, the bony fish, and in next note set, we'll talk about cartilaginous fish, which would be our sharks and rays. But let's just take a moment and look at the jawless fish briefly. Now, the jawless fish are essentially a throwback to more of an ancient version of fish that happened, of course, before jaws were essentially evolved. Now, the hagfish are interesting because they are essentially scavengers. They will go after dead bodies on the seafloor. They'll scavenge across like whale carcasses, things like that, wiggle into flesh and go in there. They're kind of a little disgusting. They've got a huge amount of slime that comes out in them. Very interesting. You can look up YouTube videos on it. Now, when it comes to lampreys, this is another kind of thing. Now, as juveniles, they're filter feeders, but as adults, they are sort of predatory. They feed on the blood of other fish, and what they do is they use this mouth that has these kind of teeth in it, and the sucker-like mouth, to attach to the fish and start to rip into the body, the flesh, and their salivary glands have this anticoagulant, and that allows them to keep sucking and feeding on the blood of the fish. And of course, a lot of times the fish eventually dies. So very weird types of fish, but that's your jawless fish. Bony fish appeared around 420 million years ago, and of course, they're about the largest class of vertebrates, about 28,000 species to date. And they have very specific characteristics, obviously, bony skeleton and jaws. They have an operculum, which is essentially a bony flap of skin that covers and protects the gills. They also have a swim bladder or other buoyancy devices. And a swim bladder is a buoyancy organ that's found in the bony fish. Now, there are two subclasses that we can look at. There's lobe-finned and ray-finned fishes. Now, lobe-finned fishes are your coelacanths and lungfish, and they're pictured over on the right. This is really, really cool fish, and again, very ancient throwback designs, specifically the coelacanth, which we thought was a fossil. We have them in the fossil record some 70 million years ago. Now, in 1938, a living coelacanth was actually found in the deep water off of the coast of South Africa. Very awesome discovery, and I highly recommend you read about it. There's a really cool book called A Fish Caught in Time that kind of goes through that whole process of discovery. However, we are going to spend our time talking about the ray-finned fishes, the more recognizable fish that we see in the ocean all the time. Now, you probably already know that fish have scales, and you probably already think that fish might be a bit slimy because they have mucus. So let's talk about it. So scales are overlapping segments of bone covered by skin and mucus that are found on the outside of the fish. Now, they do serve several really important functions. They help to protect the fish and increase hydrodynamic efficiency. Those are two really big functions. Now, there are two types of scales that we'll talk about, actually. There's cycloid and ctenoid. Now, the cycloid are more smooth edge scales, and the ctenoid are more of a toothed edge scale. Now, these scales form growth rings, which can indicate the rate of growth, so you can actually get a little bit of knowledge out of that as well. Now, there are glands in the skin that secrete the mucus, and that mucus is really important. It helps reduce the drag, and so it helps the fish move through the water a little bit more efficiently, but it also is part of the immune system. It actually helps. It's like the first line of defense of anything kind of invading the body, and so we want to make sure we keep that mucus layer intact, especially if we happen to be handling fish and putting them back into the wild. Now, another really important adaptation is the lateral line. Now, the lateral line is a canal on the head and the side of the fish that contains sense organs. They're externally visible in bony fish, so you can actually see the lateral line, if you will. Now, on cartilaginous fish like sharks, you don't see it so much because it's under the skin. Either way, they are sensitive to changes in water pressure and electrical fields, so they have a little electroperception ability there. Now, why is this important? So any moving object in the water creates a series of pressure waves that kind of ripples out. Swimming fish, whether it's a predator or prey item, creates these waves, right? So a few things. First, this system of lateral line and pressure wave detection allows fish to school. So if you've ever seen those massive schools and how the fish kind of change direction exactly and perfectly with each other, that is happening because of the ability of the fish to sense each other through the lateral line. And of course, obviously, there's also predator detection and prey detection. So those are things that are useful as well with the lateral line. Now, in terms of buoyancy regulation, there are several different adaptations we have. The most classic, of course, would be the swim bladder, and that's that buoyancy organ found in bony fish. It's a gas bladder. It holds nitrogen and oxygen gas that is essentially entered into the organ through diffusion from the blood vessels. Now, it is not the only adaptation for buoyancy. First of all, if you're swimming forward, those fish, that swimming motion provides lift. Sharks use this a lot as well. Storage of low density compounds, essentially oils. Now, if you've ever put oil in water, you'll notice the oil floats up. That's the same deal here. If you have a higher composition of oils in your body, that is going to make you less dense, and that's going to help you not to sink. Also, reduction of heavy tissues. If you've ever wondered why fish have such fine little tiny bones and it's annoying because you don't want to eat them, that kind of a thing, that's that reduction of heavy tissues. And of course, that makes those bones really, really thin. All of these things can be utilized in different types of fish. Now, the deeper you go, you tend to lose swim bladders in fish. The reason for that, and when you start getting into the deep ocean, the pressure is quite high. And if you have an air sac, that's going to be affected by that pressure. So it all depends on how deep you are as to whether or not you use a swim bladder or not. Now let's turn our attention to the form and function sort of adaptations. So fin shape is a really good teller of essentially the lifestyle and the abilities of a particular fish. Now, fins protrude from the body surface and assist in movement, stabilization, positioning, reproduction, and even protection. So we have a number of different fin types. You probably are aware of them or heard of them before. We have the pectoral fins, which assist in turning and balance and stopping and and swimming. They are generally right along the pectoral muscles on either side of the fish. Now, flying fish will use them to actually leap above the water, which is kind of fun if you ever get a chance to see it. Now, the pelvic fins assist more in stabilization. They can be adapted to actually assist in walking or on sticking onto the benthic substrate. If you look at little fish like blennies and gobies and things like that, they use those pelvic fins to sort of help them stabilize as they're sitting on the ground. Then you have the anal fins, which are found behind the anus or the cloaca. And again, those are, a stabilization thing. You'll see that along in terms of a function on a lot of the different fins. Now, the dorsal fin is found on the back surface of the fish, and there can be a number of dorsal fins. You can have up to about 3 of them, and they tend to assist in steering and balance. Now, they also protect the fish from rolling, and it also enables them to stop and have like more dramatic turns, that kind of a thing. Now, some have spines that also provide additional protection, which obviously spines can be a little pointy and hard to bite or scratch and get at. Now, frogfish use the spine on the dorsal fin to actually attract prey. If you've ever seen the types of fish that dangle something out and actually kind of get something to come through, well, the frogfish use their dorsal spine to do that a little bit. Now, the caudal fin is the back tail fin. Most people would call it the tail fin. And it's found at the end of the fish, the back end of the fish. And it is generally the main source of power for propulsion. So that's where you get most of your power from in terms of that. Now, you do have some fish that do like to swim with their pectoral fins quite a lot. But that's just semantics. Now, there are different shapes of caudal fins, and this helps to support different swimming styles. So let's look at them. So here are different shapes of caudal fins. And so we have first the lunate, which is really the kind of powerhouse, energy efficient fin. This is where you essentially are going to be swimming at high speeds for long distances very consistently. This is the type of fin you want. It reduces turbulence, it's very energy efficient, things like that. Now, as you go into the more forked into kind of truncated rounded tails, you have a sort of spectrum of speeds. Forked tails are designed for that continuous swimming. The deeper the fork, the faster the fish, so to speak. As you get into rounded and kind of truncated, you start to get a little bit more of a slower swimmer, but they can do long distances at that slower speed, and they have the ability to have a bit more of a burst of speed to catch a prey item. So that is something, but they can't sustain that speed for any length of time. Then we have what we call the heterocircle tails. These are this imaged on the far right. These tend to be a very fast tail design, and they provide downward thrust as well as forward propulsion just due to that larger upper lobe of the tail. So this helps with buoyancy. Now, generally, this is found in most sharks, so you're going to see that in most sharks. All right, let's talk briefly about the circulatory system now. It is a closed circulatory system with a 2-chambered heart, and of course we have gills, which is the site of gas exchange across the surface, which provides for respiration. Now, gills are essentially supported by bony structure called gill arches. And gills do provide a very high efficiency in water because water only has about 2.5% of the oxygen that air does. This is one of the reasons why lungs don't work very well in water, one of many reasons. And essentially, if you think about it, with lungs, you have to take in that air all the way down into your lungs and back out again. It's a long pathway. With gills, you don't have that. So they're much more efficient and they're able to work in lower oxygen environments. Now, there's a couple of ways you can actually use the gills. You can, first of all, pump them, muscular pumping mechanisms to flow water over the gills, or you have what we call ram ventilation, in which the fish opens its mouth and swims forward. The water comes in the mouth and out the gills. Now let's talk about reproduction. Now, in general, fish are not great parents, but they don't have to be. They value quantity over quality, and that is what we call an R strategist. It's focused on having a lot of offspring, most of which are going to get eaten and killed early on, and only a couple are going to survive. Now, fish do this two different ways. They have what we call pelagic broadcast spawning, where you have the big schools of fish. They all release their eggs and sperm in the water. Hopefully they get fertilized, and then those larvae are on their own to deal with life. Now then you also have the benthic egg laying. Now this occurs in some of the benthic, or fish that live on the bottom species. Now this is where you get just a little bit of parenting. For example, this picture is a sergeant major, a male sergeant major, kind of protecting his eggs, and that's actually role reverse there, right? The females come to lay the eggs, the males fertilize them, and then the female swims off into the big blue, never to be seen again. And the male guards the nest until the eggs hatch and the larvae kind of go off. But after that, he's done and he goes away, and all those larvae, they're on their own and they're in the planktonic world and they're going to get eaten and massacred by everybody. So that's sort of how it goes. Now, we of course don't want all of these larval fish to actually become adults, because you wouldn't be able to actually swim in the ocean. It would be just thick with fish. So there is a balance there, and that's why. And of course, this is also leading up to the discussion of why fish are important to the food web, because of course larval forms of the fish are part of plankton. So let's talk about those ecological important roles that bony fish have. Now first, bony fish contain a significant portion of marine organic nutrients in their tissues just by the fact that they're alive, and they help move these things around. For example, migration. So through feeding and reproduction and moving around different areas, they're going to essentially link different nutrient cycles together in different habitats. Now, bony fish do a lot of excreting just like the rest of us, right? And if they are excreting nitrogenous waste and phosphorus waste and things like that, that's going to be added back into the environment and generally absorbed by primary producers. Now, there's a lot of linking going on. We have what we call planktivorous fish, or fish that eat plankton, and that links the nutrients in plankton to higher consumer levels, including larger fish, that kind of a thing. We also have fish that link to the terrestrial environment. For example, fish that wash up on shore or are harvested by terrestrial animals will redistribute those nutrients onto land. Now, a good example of this would be salmon. Now, bears in the Pacific Northwest feed on salmon, and they are grabbing them out of the water and bringing them up on land, and that redistributes that nutrients. And of course, salmon do have a connection with the ocean, so there's a back and forth there. If you use too much of a resource, of course, you are going to have a collapse. And when we over-harvest fish, beyond their sustainable levels, we can collapse fish stocks, and that negatively impacts the nutrient cycling in whatever habitat we're talking about. Now, in terms of the economic importance, it is driven by the fact that fish meat is an important source of protein and the essential 5 amino acids we need as humans, right? Now, different parts of the world actually get more or less of their protein through seafood, so it does vary. But this also comes down again to the industries that support this and the hardworking fishermen around the world, that this is their livelihood. This is how they make money in employment and support their families. And I'm generally talking about those who are kind of in the lower end of that really work hard every day. Now, when fish stocks collapse because they're not being managed well, that has a really direct negative impact on those fishing communities that are supported by that activity. So we do need to look at the economics of this as well. Now, there are non-edible parts of the fish that are also used, and there's a bunch of them listed here. Everything from the parts that are ground up as fish meal that are actually part of animal feed or fertilizer. Oil can be used for soap, candles, and varnish and paints. The skin can be made into lanterns and glue. Air bladders can make a powder used in wine and beer making. And the scales can actually be used as jewelry. So quite a lot of diversified uses of fish parts. And of course, there also is tourism as an economic benefit as well, because people like to go fishing. They like to go places to see fish, whether it's scuba diving, snorkeling, things like that. And that draws people in. So when you have a healthy fishery, when you have a lot of the fish available on the reef and out for people to go out and recreational fish, this drives tourism. There's also the aquarium trade for tropical fish, which I'll probably get into at some point during the year, because there's major issues with that too in terms of how those animals are collected. And then, of course, there's also scientific research that goes along with working with fish in captive environments. Now let's review a little bit of a case study on the Peruvian anchovy industry. So anchovies are a small fish that live up to about 3 years and grow to about 20 centimeters. They are filter feeders. They go after zooplankton, and they're considered a foraging fish, and they're found in the open ocean. Their prey fish is consumed by predators. So they are constantly being eaten by everybody, including large fish such as tuna and salmon, dolphins, whales, seabirds, all that kind of stuff. Now, the Peruvian anchovy fishery is the largest single species fishery in the world, which is kind of amazing. They're very important to the economy of the local community there. So we've talked about El Nino in previous note sets, and this essentially shuts down the upwelling that provides that cool nutrient-rich water. So once that is shut down, there's no more nutrients left, the productivity drops, and the number of fish, including anchovies, decreases. Now, in 1972, the industry collapsed due to overfishing and a combination of that and El Nino that occurred at the same time. Now, the fishing industry then shifted to sardines for several years until El Nino passed. Now, another decrease happened in the 80s and in 2014 due to El Nino impacts as well. Now, this impacts a lot of things, including bird populations that feed on anchovies. And interestingly enough, that these decreases in anchovy and decreases in birds decrease the amount of guano or bird poop, essentially, that goes back onto land that actually helps bring nutrients on land. All right, everybody, that is a wrap for today. Remember, bony fish are the largest group of vertebrates in the ocean and are especially adapted to living in aquatic environments. They play an important role in the nutrient cycling and trophic links and human economic systems. And of course, until next time, keep learning.